The protagonist, with blurred vision, looks down and notices everything around him is red. A blade pierces his chest, and with labored breathing, he remarks that all that remained in this place was death. He questions why so much blood had to be spilled. As he looks back, he sees one of his comrades lying dead. Both his brother Zhang, his friends, and the disciples, all of them, had fallen in this place. An alliance of 20 sects, comprised of the most powerful people, had been formed for the final battle against Chun Ma. However, the result was the annihilation of both sides. The cause of this devastation was the man seated atop a pile of corpses, the demon who descended from the heavens and bathed the land in blood. He was the leader of the demonic cult, known as Chun Ma. Chun Ma calls out to the Mount Hua disciple and expresses pity at seeing him in this state. The protagonist glares at him, struggling to rise while spitting blood. Chun Ma remarks that even though the protagonist survived this battle, the life of glory and fame he had envisioned was no longer possible. Both of them knew their end was near. The protagonist tells Chun Ma to shut up. From atop the pile of corpses, Chun Ma extends his arm, acknowledging the Mount Hua disciple. He declares that while many had aided in this final battle, it was the protagonist's blade that delivered the final blow. As the leader of the demonic cult, Chun Ma recognizes the blade of Mount Hua as the most powerful weapon on Earth. The protagonist yells at him to be silent once more and charges toward him. Chun Ma remarks that it's a shame because, with just one more day, the Mount Hua disciple might have been worthy of the name Chun Ma. However, he says this doesn't matter, urging the disciple to remember that this was not the end. The demonic forces would return, and when they did, the world would fall under their control. The protagonist extends his sword as Chun Ma declares that when the day came, the demonic cult would be unstoppable. A slash cuts through, leaving a line on the demon's neck. Chun Ma evaporates, his head rolling down the pile of corpses. Atop it all, the protagonist declares the war is over, though he already knows his own life has ended. What he wants to know is what will become of Mount Hua. All the most powerful members who participated in this advance were dead. The only ones left in the sect were children who barely knew how to hold a sword. He wonders if all this bloodshed was worth anything. He reflects that, had he trained harder, he might have saved at least one of them. But it no longer mattered. Standing atop the pile, he laments that it was all in vain. Even the brightest things eventually rot. The protagonist was the 13th disciple of Mount Hua and the strongest swordsman on Earth, known as the Master of the Blossoming Blade, Chung Myung. He had finally taken the life of the demon who brought catastrophe to the land. But in the end, he died atop the 100,000 mountain peaks. That was the legacy he should have left behind on Earth. Before all of this, a baby had been abandoned in front of Mount Hua. Two elderly people approached and picked him up from the ground. Sometime later, the boy was practicing swordsmanship. One of his teachers called out to Chung Myung, whose consciousness questioned the visions he was seeing. The teacher scolded him, reminding him that, as someone training in martial arts, he should follow the right path and not resort to violence. At the time, he felt somewhat angry, as he was always being reprimanded. Though he was a member of the sect, he had not fully embraced its teachings. Even though he earned the title of Swordmaster, he should never have forgotten that he owed everything to Mount Hua. One of the sect masters asked if he had any regrets. Unconsciously, within his own mind, Chung Myung replied that he had countless regrets. He wished he had followed the teachings of the sect more closely. Perhaps then he would have become an even stronger warrior and somehow changed the outcome of this tragedy. However, Zhang spoke up, saying there was no need for regrets. All of this was part of the Mount Hua Sect's destiny, and he was sure they would continue to exist. The scene shifts to a boy being hit on the head inside a tent. An argument unfolds as the boy tries to defend himself, asking where Chim is. The person in front of him demands to know what business he has with Chinamama. The boy, with a wooden stick on his back, claims he doesn't know who Chin is and insists he's just a stinking street rat. Everyone else demanded money, yet there he was, sleeping as if he owned the place. The boy was utterly confused, wondering what was happening, as it seemed a beggar was threatening him. The boy who had woken up warned the other to put down the stick before he got hurt. The other man laughed, leaving the boy desperate. Losing patience, the boy retorted that not even the leader of the beggars' sect should treat him like that. Raising his arm, the boy declared that the man was screwed now. The protagonist then stretched out his hand, ready to teach the man a lesson, but noticed something strange. The wooden stick came down. While wondering why his arm seemed so small, the boy realized he couldn't block the attack and was hit on the head again. The other man mocked him, calling him shameless, and hit him repeatedly. At this point, someone else got involved in the fight, but upon seeing the beating, decided to leave. Sometime later, the boy sat by a river, bleeding from his nose. He remarked that he hadn't been beaten this badly, even at Mount Hua. Still, one day, he would get back at that bastard. Falling silent, he looked into the water, wondering who the child in the reflection was. It seemed like one of those reincarnation stories Buddhists believe in. As he pondered this, he thought that if it were true, he should have reincarnated into Shaolin. Suddenly, someone appeared behind him. The boy called out, and Chung Myung accused him of watching the fight earlier and running away. The boy apologized, saying Wang Cho sometimes went too far. Chung Myung raised a finger, announcing that he would ask 2 questions. The boy was confused. After a moment of silence, Chung Myung asked if he was a beggar. The boy confirmed it, saying it was obvious based on his clothes. Chung Myung crouched down angrily, lamenting what kind of cursed reincarnation this was. Standing up, he moved to his second question, mentioning the name Chun Ma. He asked if the boy knew who that was. The boy responded that it seemed the beating had driven Chung Myung crazy. Still, he answered, saying Chun Ma was the great leader of the demonic cult who had died 100 years ago. Chung Myung was shocked, unable to believe this story. He grabbed the boy by the collar, demanding to know if this was true. Hesitant, the boy asked why he would lie about something so stupid. The protagonist released him, struggling to accept that 100 years had passed. It seemed he had been reborn, but long after his death. In a way, it was as if he had returned to a world where he was completely alone. Feeling disheartened, the boy asked if he was okay. That's when Chung Myung remembered Mount Hua. He said the sect's name and asked what had happened to it. Puzzled, the boy asked what Mount Hua was. Alarmed, Chung Myung questioned how a beggar could belong to the Beggars' Union yet not know about Mount Hua, one of the 10 greatest sects in the world. The boy, confused, listed the names of the great sects and stated that none of them were called Mount Hua. Chung Myung shrugs. It doesn't matter. What he needs to know now is the name of the boy who had beaten him. The boy introduces himself as Ku Chil and mentions that the leader's name was Wang Cho. Chung Myung, with a hint of approval, says that good deeds are always repaid doubly, but vengeance comes back tenfold. He tells the boy to remember his name, Chung Myung of Mount Hua, for one day he will pay for this kindness. As Chung Myung begins to leave, he quickly turns around and asks for directions to Mount Hua. A second later, birds fly away as he races through the forest. But the problem is, he's already exhausted. He recalls that, in his past life, he could run faster than a horse. But now, after pushing himself, he collapses on the ground like an idiot, his heart nearly giving out. This damn child's body couldn't keep moving for even 15 minutes. At this rate, he'll die before he even gets close to Mount Hua. With his face pressed to the ground, he wonders how he's supposed to make it to Shangxi. Then, a smile creeps onto his face. He says, "It's time to use the great intellect of Master Chung Myung." He gets excited, thinking that this is an incredible opportunity. Even those who reach the peak of mastery have regrets. One of his had been his laziness when he was younger. He never listened to the elders and was always dragged to the training grounds. All he ever wanted was to escape. On top of that, he used to steal his teacher's drinks, which made them furious. However, there was one thing he never intended to change in this life. He then leans against a tree and reflects, realizing that in the end, it's all about starting over. First, he needs a place without distractions. This spot will have to do. Sitting down in front of the tree, he tries to recall the best technique for this situation. He knows countless ways to increase his energy, many of which surpass the knowledge of Mount Hua. But he isn't sure which one to learn first. Then, he remembers a technique called the 6 elements. It was a cheap text sold for 5 coins in street shops, known for its poor quality. However, despite its reputation, it wasn't a bad technique at all. The The 6 elements was the first thing the disciples of Mount Hua learned. It wasn't extraordinary, but it allowed a practitioner's body to be purified. It was a foundational technique for those in no rush to master anything, perfect for someone like him, who needed to build a solid foundation slowly. He begins to gather energy within his body. The strange roots rise through him as he manages to purify his chi bit by bit. Little by little, he gathers this purified energy in the center of his body. That small point of power marks the beginning of his journey in this life. He stands up, saying that this seed will eventually create an unstoppable avalanche. But as soon as he rises, he collapses again, realizing he used all his energy on that. Lying on the ground, he remembers Brother Jang always saying his problem was not using his head. He wonders how he will make it to Mount Hua at this pace. The scene shifts to a bustling city. Some boys run into an alley and call for their brother, warning him that another beggar is asking for money. With very few coins left, everyone is giving money to this beggar. The Mohawk guy stands up and says it's time to show how things work in this area. He gets excited and tells everyone to follow. Later, a small boy is shown in the corner of a wall, eating. It's none other than Chung Myung. The boys shout at him, ordering him to stop pretending. He doesn't hear them. Chung Myung looks up, asking if they're talking to him. The Mohawk guy says, "Of course we are. There's no one else around." He threatens Chung Myung, saying that he better hand over everything he has, including the food in his hand. Chung Myung looks at the food and calls them greedy scoundrels, asking why they want what he's already bitten into. The boys crack their knuckles, saying that he deserves a lesson. But Chung Myung just stands up, throws a small punch, and says that he's fine. Looking at the boys, he warns them that he isn't very strong yet, but it's enough. He's already gotten used to his new body, and he doesn't have time to waste. They should all come at him at once. The beggar nearly explodes with rage. He had been planning to go easy on the kid, but now he tells his crew to finish him off. The first one stretches out his arm to throw a punch, but Chung Myung easily dodges it. He looks at the guy, clenches his fist, and hits him squarely on the cheek. The guy flies away, and Chung Myung asks, "Do you know who I am? I am the master of the blossoming blade, known as Chung Myung of the Great Mount Hua." With that, the fight begins. After some time, they end up apologizing, and Chung Myung tells them not to call him sir, because he's just a beggar too. One of the guys calls him a beggar, and Chung Myung asks what kind of disrespect that is. After a moment, he says, "Whatever," and asks for the fastest way to Shanxi. The guy responds, saying it's an easy question, but if they were smart, they wouldn't be begging on the streets. Chung Myung laughs, agreeing it makes sense. They all laugh together until he suddenly grabs the man by the collar and warns him that the next time they meet, he better have learned some geography of the area. He threatens that if, in the future, he asks something and doesn't know the answer, he'll suffer greatly. At that moment, the beggars scatter, running off as Chung Myung yells for them to scram. The scene shifts to a sunset over the mountains. An old man is seen gazing at the landscape when someone calls out, addressing him as the sect leader. The person introduces himself as and the leader allows him to enter. Enters, apologizing, but explains that a child is insisting on meeting the leader. The old man looks puzzled and asks who this child is. Replies that the boy's name is Chung Myung, and he claims to want to join Mount Hua. The sect leader appears even more confused by the unusual request and asks if told the child they weren't accepting any new disciples. Confirms he did, but the boy desperately insisted on speaking with the leader. Chung Myung stands there with a smile on his face, but internally, he is seething with anger over what had just happened. A little earlier, he had finally reached the entrance to Mount Hua. The damn beggars had given him a useless shortcut, but in the end, he managed to find his way. Now, the hardest part lay ahead, climbing up to the sect. He climbed the stairs, waded through mud, and scaled the mountain. Though he had taken this path countless times before, his current body made the task far from easy. Yet, with determination, he finally reached the top of Mount Hua. However, what greeted him left him in disbelief. In front of the sect, there wasn't even a sign bearing the name of the place. He remembered how Brother Zhang used to clean the engraved name every single morning. He had barely arrived and already couldn't believe the state of the sect. Just then, the door creaked open, and someone asked who he was. It was Unam, who found it odd that a child had appeared there and immediately asked how he managed to climb the mountain on his own. The protagonist ignored the question and instead asked if the man standing before him was a disciple of Mount Hua. When the man confirmed, Chung Myung was relieved. They weren't completely extinct. Unam then said the boy could come in if he wanted, explaining that although they didn't typically allow visitors, it was too late to send him back down the mountain. At least, he reasoned, the boy would have shelter since the nights were cold. But as soon as Chung Myung stepped inside, he was struck by shock. The training ground, once a marvelous marble arena, was now nothing more than a barren field. Unam noticed his reaction and asked if something was wrong. Smiling, Chung Myung responded that he was just admiring the incredible training area of the sect. But when he glanced to the side, he saw something even more bewildering. The Palace of the Heavens, which used to stand next door, had vanished entirely. Feigning ignorance, he remarked how strange it was to see a staircase leading to nowhere and asked what had happened. Unam explained that the elders said there used to be a palace in that spot long ago. Chung Myung, in disbelief, thought to himself that he knew there was a palace. He wanted to know how it disappeared. Unam, however, claimed a child wouldn't understand and called the disappearance a glorious battle scar. Chung Myung silently retorted that there was nothing glorious about it. When the elder asked what he said, Chung Myung replied, "Nothing." Unam then led the way, promising to show Chung Myung where he would be staying. As they walked, Chung Myung reflected on how hard it must have been to keep the sect going all these years. They arrived at the Jade Temple, and to his relief, and at least that was still intact. Unam began to open the door, explaining that at Mount Hua, they followed the path of righteousness and, as such, first showed respect to those who came before them. However, as soon as Chung Myung stepped inside, he was met with yet another shock. 2 items that were supposed to be there had disappeared: a golden pot gifted by Emperor Jin and a handmade scroll from their ancestors. Furthermore, a golden dragon piece that had once adorned the place was also gone. Drawing closer, he wondered aloud if there wasn't supposed to be a cherry blossom flower in a specific spot. Unam, puzzled, asked how he knew that. Reflecting thoughtfully, Unam admitted that there really used to be a cherry blossom made of metal in that very location. Excited, Chung Myung asked what had happened to it. Unam nonchalantly revealed that they had sold it, as it wasn't particularly useful and didn't fit the temple's aesthetics. A merchant had made a good offer, so they let it go. Hearing this, Chung Myung could only think of Brother Zhang and lament how this marked the true end of Mount Hua. The petal of the night-blooming fragrance had disappeared, along with all the treasures of the sect. The worst part, however, was that the sect had sold these priceless items for money. Unam noticed his expression and asked if he was all right. Chung Myung muttered to himself that he needed to fix this mess as soon as possible. At that moment, he knelt down and made a request. He wanted to become a disciple of Mount Hua. Back in the present, the sect leader asked why he wanted to join, and if he even knew what kind of place Mount Hua was. Chung Myung replied with a confident yes, knowing it wouldn't be easy to be accepted. He had already prepared a story to tell, a story involving a member named Jam Jing, who disappeared during the war. He planned to say that Jam Jing was found by a passerby on the mountain who saved him. Out of gratitude, Jam Jing supposedly taught the passerby the martial techniques of Mount Hua, and Chung Myung would claim to be the descendant of the man who saved him. This story would grant him the status of a direct disciple of one of the sect's great members, now putting him on equal footing with the sect leader. However, much to his surprise, the leader simply accepted his request without question. Dumbfounded, Chung Myung asked why. The old man replied that the boy seemed eager to join, so how could he refuse? Even Unam found it strange, remarking that they hadn't accepted new members in a long time. But the leader said he had changed his mind, adding that destiny often worked in mysterious ways. Chung Myung found it baffling that the sect leader wasn't more suspicious of him, a complete stranger. Yet the leader explained that, regardless of the boy's intent, Mount Hua never refused a bird seeking shelter from the rain or shared food in the winter. They could not, in good conscience, turn away a child in such a situation. He then instructed Unam to show the boy to the beginner's room and start the initiation ceremony. However, Chung Myung wasn't pleased at all. In this way, his dream of securing an exceptional position within the sect had been utterly crushed. The next scene reveals him dressed in a third-grade disciple's robe. As he looks around, he notices that the room he's been given used to serve a completely different purpose: rituals. It doesn't seem like a temporary solution either. In the old Mount Hua, disciples would typically be assigned a mentor and live alongside them. He begins wandering about, trying to make sense of his surroundings, when someone suddenly shouts, demanding to know who he is. Chung Myung turns, and a boy steps forward, accusing him of spying on other people's rooms. He even goes so far as to imply that he might be some sort of thief. As if summoned, more disciples appear, and someone asks Ghoul what's happening. Ghoul declares that he caught this kid snooping around the senior brother's room. Meanwhile, our protagonist wonders why he constantly finds himself in bizarre situations like this. Out of nowhere, another figure emerges and asks what all the noise is about. Why are they causing such a commotion in the dormitory when they should be focusing on training? At the sight of this man, everyone immediately bows, offering their apologies to the great brother. The man then turns to Chung Myung and asks who he is. Calmly, he replies that his name is Chung Myung. The great brother says he's heard about a new disciple joining and tells him to rest for now, but warns that tomorrow he will have to train hard. With that, he instructs everyone to get some rest, and the group shouts in agreement. As they disperse, Ghoul gives Chung Myung a frosty glare, promising that he will teach him some manners later. Chung Myung, slightly annoyed, reflects that these juniors clearly need someone to discipline them. While he initially intended to handle them in a kind and nurturing way, their behavior is going to make that difficult. The scene shifts, showing Ghoul confronting Chung Myung and demanding that he remove his robe. Confused, Chung Myung asks what he's talking about. Ghoul repeats his order, insisting that he take off all his clothes. This so-called initiation ritual was clearly a setup for humiliation, and it was clear a fight was on the horizon. For a moment, Chung Myung stays silent, then calmly says he has a question first. He asks if senior brother Eun-gum knows about this. Ghoul scoffs, explaining that the senior brother doesn't come around at night and accuses Chung Myung of trying to delay his punishment. He then asks if the new disciple is looking for a beating. But before Ghoul can finish his words, Chung Myung calmly calls him out and tells him to clench his jaw. When Ghoul opens his mouth to ask why, a punch is already flying toward his face. The other disciples stand stunned as Ghoul ends up hanging from the ceiling. Chung Myung then questions the logic of trying to beat someone into submission, warning them that he'll return the favor if necessary. A brawl breaks out within the sect, with Chung Myung effortlessly holding his ground. Later, the scene shifts to Chung Myung lounging around and calling for senior brother Sa-hyung. He demands a proper massage, while Sa-hyung apologizes profusely, vowing to do his best. Meanwhile, Chung Myung also calls for Ghoul, ordering him to stop trembling and come closer. He has some questions and expects answers since he's new to the sect. Nervously, Ghoul agrees to answer everything. Chung Myung begins by asking what happened to the Golden Palace and why the Mount Hua Sect is in such a dire financial state. Ghoul hesitates, but eventually explains that it all ties back to the master of the blossoming blade. Chung Myung, pretending not to know, says he's heard of him, because after all, that's him. Ghoul then elaborates that the senior disciples always speak of the master of the blossoming blade as a hero who killed Chun Ma, the leader of the demonic cult. However, after Chun Ma's death, the cult retaliated, launching a massive assault on Mount Hua. The sect was utterly destroyed and has never truly recovered. Chung Myung is shaken, realizing that his failure in that fateful battle might have been the catalyst for Mount Hua's downfall. A flashback follows, showing a conversation between Chung Myung and the sect leader, Zhang. They discuss techniques, and Chung Myung suggests discarding certain useless ones. Zhang agrees, nodding thoughtfully. During their discussion, Zhang brings up a different topic, suggesting that it's time for Chung Myung to take on an apprentice. He asks how Chung Myung plans to pass on his techniques to a disciple. Clenching his fists, Chung Myung confidently declares that it'll be simple. He'll beat the boy until he learns. After all, Anyone would start understanding something after being beaten enough. Amused, Zhang quickly drops the idea of making him a teacher. Back in the present, someone calls for senior brother Chung Myung. From his bed, he tells them not to be so formal and to just call him junior brother. The messenger informs him that senior brother Unam has requested everyone's presence at the training field. Soon, all the disciples are outside, swords in hand. Unam instructs them to raise their swords and execute the first strike. They obey, performing the move while Chung Myung watches from the side, standing next to Nam. However, he quickly becomes confused and asks what they call that technique. Nam replies that it's the true six-element sword technique, a foundational skill in Mount Hua. Chung Myung, however, knows better. This technique is far from being the foundation of Mount Hua's teachings. To him, it seems like they're trying to teach philosophy to people who don't even know the alphabet. Such training might offer a temporary advantage, but it fails to create true martial artists. Worse yet, the person demonstrating the technique is doing it incorrectly. He looks up at the sky, which is clear and empty, much like Mount Hua's future. He grimly thinks. He wonders where he should even begin fixing this mess. Calling over the boy beside him, who jumps in surprise, Chung Myung asks what other techniques they're learning here. The boy eagerly explains that after mastering the true six-element sword technique, they move on to the seven sages sword technique. From there, they study the clarity of the sword technique in the Blossom Hall. But Chung Myung is unimpressed. The boy continues, proudly declaring that the ultimate pinnacle of Mount Hua's martial arts is the Great Sword Pacification technique. Hearing this, Chung Myung's frustration grows. He remembers Zhang deliberately discarding that technique, deeming it ineffective. Now, the trash he had thrown away is being hailed as Mount Hua's pinnacle achievement. Chung Myung wonders aloud about the fate of the Plum Blossom technique of 24 strikes, but the boy doesn't seem to know. Later that night, Chung Myung calls for Gul, who cautiously approaches. He assures Gul to relax and says he needs a favor. He instructs Gul to gather everyone in the training hall at 5 a.m. the next morning. He also lists a few items he needs prepared, 5 for each person. Though skeptical, Gul agrees, and Chung Myung reassures him with a mischievous smile, saying he appreciates how helpful he is. But as he watches Gul leave, Chung Myung contemplates the state of Mount Hua. The sect has no money, no proper techniques, and no real talent. At this rate, no one would be surprised if they shut down tomorrow. For now, all Chung Myung can offer is his own talent. The third-class disciples are far from extraordinary martial artists, but he believes a great sect isn't built in a day. If he has to rebuild Mount Hua using these amateurs, so be it. The next morning, everyone wakes up at 5 a.m., groggy and furious. They question why they're being forced to follow the orders of that annoying junior. Some even grumble about how everyone knows they were beaten. Suddenly, Chung Myung appears, and the room falls silent. One disciple bravely asks who he thinks he is to summon everyone so early. Chung Myung stays quiet for a moment, then apologizes with a smile. He says he forgot to consider everyone's feelings and invites those who don't feel like training to talk it out privately. He ushers the dissenters into a room, closing the door behind them. Moments later, the entire house begins to shake. The remaining disciples are baffled until the door bursts open and the dissenters come running out, pale and terrified. Seeing the now disciplined group, Chung Myung announces that physical training will begin at 5 a.m. every day from now on. Smirking, he declares that all his senior brothers are completely useless. The sun began to rise as Unam stirred awake in his room. He noticed something strange. None of the disciples had come to greet him. This could only mean one thing. Everyone was still asleep. He sighed, suspecting it had something to do with the new disciple. They must have been up all night fooling around. Stepping out of his room, he muttered that he'd have to teach them all a lesson. He had expected Yanzhong to keep things in order, but clearly that wasn't the case. As he walked further, his confusion deepened. Everywhere he looked, disciples were sprawled across the ground, completely exhausted. They looked less like disciples and more like a group of old men. Alarmed, he shouted, demanding to know what had happened and why there was such chaos. The disciples exchanged hesitant glances, their fear evident. Unam found it particularly troubling to see even Jo-el among the group, utterly worn out. In the middle of it all was the new recruit, Chung Myung, crouching with two enormous rocks in his hands. He exhaled deeply before lifting them again, counting as he reached over 10,065 repetitions. Spotting Unam, Chung Myung greeted him with a cheery "good morning," despite being visibly on the brink of exhaustion. Unam, struggling to comprehend the situation, immediately ordered someone to fetch water for the boy. But Chung Myung waved off the concern, claiming he was fine. After taking a small sip, Unam pressed him for answers, asking what exactly had transpired. The boy casually explained it was nothing serious. They had simply woken up a bit earlier to do some training. Strangely, everyone had been so motivated that they decided to extend their session. This response baffled Unam. He glanced at the disciples, who looked terrified, and quickly pieced things together. The source of all this motivation was clearly Chung Myung. How could these disciples, calling themselves part of Mount Hua, be intimidated by a mere child? Determined to re-establish order, he decided to teach the boy a lesson. Addressing Chung Myung, Unam stated that even the White Blossom Hall had rules. He demanded to know who had given permission for such unauthorized early morning training sessions. With an innocent expression, Chung Myung suggested they stop if that was the case. Unam blinked in confusion at the boy's unexpectedly compliant response. This kid was crafty. His demeanor left no room for reprimand, making it hard to accuse him outright. If word spread that a child had outclassed all the third-class disciples, it would tarnish the sect's reputation and make the instructors look like fools. As Unam wrestled with his thoughts, Chung Myung calmly requested 1 month to train with the others. He promised that within that time, the results would be undeniable. Besides, the seniors seemed strangely enthusiastic about the rigorous training, and no one had complained. He asked for their agreement, and the disciples, wary of contradicting him, nervously muttered their approval. Unam was astonished. The boy had effectively silenced everyone and taken control, all while maintaining a facade of innocence. Where had they found such a clever and determined recruit? In such a short time, he had dominated the third-class disciples and made them train with uncharacteristic diligence. Curious, Unam asked why the boy, too, seemed so eager to endure grueling training. With a resolute tone, Chung Myung explained that every minute spent resting was a minute lost to improvement. Training harder, he said, required no justification. Impressed despite himself, Unam asked Chung Myung what the most vital aspect of the relationship between senior and junior brothers was. The boy immediately replied, "Respect," and solemnly vowed to always follow the senior's commands. This response made Unam realize that the boy was not only clever, but also careful not to disrupt the hierarchy of the sect. Begrudgingly, Unam admitted that the kid had a way of getting what he wanted. Turning back to the group, Unam praised them loudly, marveling at their dedication and willingness to train so early. He encouraged them to keep it up, predicting great strength in their future. But his words weren't met with relief. The disciples had been hoping for rescue, not praise. Ignoring their silent pleas, Unam hurried away, leaving them to their fates. Chung Myung watched him leave and tightened his fist, chiding the group for asking for help. How could they seek assistance when he had no intention of harming them? He asked them to step inside for another conversation, and the scene shifted to the sounds of them being disciplined once again. Days passed, and Chung Myung continued his relentless training. Though his energy center was still weak and underdeveloped, it was gradually forming. During this time, he also learned more about Mount Hua's current state. The dormitory system had been implemented because there weren't enough instructors anymore. Additionally, the sect leader and the two masters, while well-intentioned and kind, were remarkably weak. Their strength paled in comparison to even the weakest disciples of Mount Hua a century ago. Naturally, the third-class disciples were even worse. But none of this mattered to Chung Myung. He was here now, and Mount Hua would once again rise as the #1 sect in the land. That was his ultimate goal. The scene shifted to the dining hall, where a boy struggled to pick up food. His hands were so sore from training that he dropped it immediately. Frustrated, he muttered that while training was fine, they at least needed enough strength to eat. Turning to Gul, he asked him to speak to Chung Myung about easing up on the training. No one had been able to use their chopsticks for days. But Gul dismissed the complaint, saying he wasn't a messenger boy. If anyone had an issue with Chung Myung, they could take it up with him directly. Gul then excused himself, saying he wanted to talk to Yanzhong. Outside, Gul struck up a conversation with Yanzhong, asking what he thought of Mount Hua. Yanzhong admitted it was a difficult question. Gul remarked that he could always return to his family, but he knew Yanzhong's goal was to stay and thrive in the sect. Yanzhong agreed, and the two shared a moment of silence. Breaking the quiet, Gul confessed that he used to think Mount Hua had no future. Shocked, Yanzhong warned him never to say such a thing aloud. But Gul continued, explaining that his perspective had changed since Chung Myung's arrival. Although their early morning training sessions were grueling, he now understood their importance. Seeing Chung Myung's unwavering dedication had inspired Gul to push himself harder. He resolved to give 100% from now on to become a true martial artist. Yanzhong smiled, sharing his sentiments. Unbeknownst to them, Chung Myung was perched in a nearby tree, eavesdropping. Pleased with what he heard, he thought to himself that he had already won over two of them. With the instructors offering little resistance, the path to restoring Mount Hua seemed long but achievable. Suddenly, loud banging came from the sect's gate. A group of men demanded the leader come out. Chung Myung, confused, watched as they yelled for the gate to be opened immediately. Someone kicked the gate open, and the men began storming in. They barked orders to fetch the leader, showing no regard for decorum. Embarrassed, Un-am and Un-ju watched as the intruders flooded the sect grounds. Chung Myung wondered who these people were. The group declared they had been waiting long enough and were losing patience. They demanded repayment, shouting for the sect leader to show himself. Realizing the depth of Mount Hua's financial troubles, Chung Myung stood before the leader's quarters, shaking his head. He muttered to himself, wondering how things had gotten this bad. Another problem awaited him, one he had no choice but to solve. The door creaks open, and the leader steps outside. Se Myung watches silently from the side, observing everything. The elder greets everyone with a calm demeanor, asking what brings them there at such a late hour. Chung Myung finds the elder's presence intriguing and quickly understands why this man has become the new leader. Every word and movement exuded a subtle wisdom, suggesting he was deliberately stalling the conversation with these men. Then, pavilion leader Mang Gong clears his throat, remarking that the sect leader seems to be doing well. The elder responds politely, expressing that he never anticipated the great owner of the pavilion would come all the way here. Regretfully, he mentions that it's unfortunate they meet under such circumstances. He explains that he had no choice but to come to Mount Hua and hopes they understand the dire situation. He reminds them that the promised repayment date had long passed. Despite favoring Mount Hua for years without demanding compensation, they have now reached their limit. He sternly announces they are giving 7 more days. If the debts aren't settled, all of Mount Hua's land will be taken immediately. A sudden shout interrupts, drawing everyone's attention. The men apologize, explaining that one of the young apprentices shouldn't have witnessed this exchange. Later, the group informs Chung Myung that these men are from the Hua prefecture. While the others discuss, Chung Myung ponders deeply, and a young boy nearby contemplates escaping before being beaten again. Joel asks if the prefecture is located just below Mount Hua, to which the boy confirms. Joel then questions whether this means Mount Hua borrowed money from the merchants of that prefecture. The boy admits he doesn't know, but has heard of someone named Mang Gong, who, as far as he knows, owns the Hua Pavilion, the largest tavern in the city. Chung Myung immediately recognizes the pavilion's name and asks if Mang Gong leads it. The two boys are startled, urging him to calm down as they watch him crack his neck. Chung Myung knows well that the Tao Pavilion once belonged to Mount Hua. Grabbing the boy by the collar, he demands if the pavilion lent money to Mount Hua and now seeks to seize it for non-repayment. The boy confirms but cannot provide further details. To Chung Myung, none of it adds up. The idea of Mount Hua borrowing from a pavilion that it once owned is absurd. Something clearly went wrong in the past. Chung Myung calls for Jo Gul, startling him. He instructs Jo Gul to fetch that thing immediately. Although confused, Jo Gul obeys, running off and soon returning with a robe. Chung Myung explains its purpose cryptically. Sometimes, to meet Buddha, you must kill him, a Buddhist saying emphasizing that straying from virtuous paths can lead to enlightenment. Donning the robe, he declares his intent to follow that teaching. The two boys are stunned, questioning if he plans to leave the sect. In an instant, Chung Myung leaps over the wall, heading toward the city. Down in the pavilion, men are laughing, amused by how speechless the sect leader was during their confrontation. They congratulate themselves on issuing a final ultimatum. One man, Gu, remarks that Mount Hua deserved this after already taking over 100,000 coins from them. Gong, smiling, acknowledges he loves money as a merchant, but admits it pains him to destroy a place so meaningful to his ancestors. Another man in a blue robe reassures him, noting the deadline had already been extended multiple times. Gong, however, quietly thinks it's nice to live with such a simple mind. Unknown to many, Mount Hua still held major influence, not through martial arts, but through its long-standing legacy. Few in the Shanxi region were unfamiliar with the sect's storied history. Gong reflects on how, over time, he has slowly built enough strength to finally bring Mount Hua down. Like a dish slowly cooking, the time has come to serve the final blow. One man asks what Gong plans to do with Mount Hua's location, suggesting it might be better to request a different payment. Gong insists the land is far more valuable than it appears, explaining it holds tremendous worth despite being abandoned. Growing agitated, Gong sets his chopsticks down, revealing his intentions earlier than planned. He tells them to think from the perspective of Mount Hua's enemies. Would they not pay handsomely to erase the legacy of such a sect? He assures them this investment will yield great profits. One man rises, praising Gong's brilliant plan and suggesting they celebrate later. Elsewhere, Jo-in is walking home, thrilled by the night's events. Confident he'll profit greatly from Mount Hua's downfall, he reflects on how much he trusts Gong. Gazing skyward, he wonders why the moon isn't visible. Suddenly, his thoughts are interrupted. Ahead of him stands Chung Myung, quietly ordering him to stay still. Jo-in finds the sight odd, a small, skinny figure standing brazenly as though wanting to be noticed. Crossing his arms, Jo-in assumes the boy plans to rob him. Chung Myung, however, calmly denies this, stating he only seeks answers. Jo-in chuckles, claiming he usually doesn't mind helping kids, but tonight is different. He warns that the boy's luck has run out, as he brought friends along for protection. Chung Myung quickly identifies the men as caravan guards. One guard suggests killing the boy, but Jo-in dismisses the idea, preferring to question him instead. As Jo-in turns, the sound of fighting catches his attention. Initially unconcerned, he soon notices the intensity of the commotion and grows uneasy. Hearing a loud bang behind him, he turns to see Chung Myung standing calmly among his defeated guards. Chung Myung remarks he only wanted to talk, but the men's hostility forced his hand. Addressing Jo-in again, he promises to spare him if he cooperates. Jo-in agrees, though fear is evident in his voice. Grabbing Jo-in by the collar, Chung Myung reiterates his warning. He notes Jo-in had refused his earlier offer to avoid a beating, so now he'll have to endure a few hits before answering. After a brief skirmish, Jo-in, bruised and swollen, begins rambling nonsense. Chung Myung reminds him to speak clearly, threatening another beating. He demands details about Mount Hua's debt and the supposed 100,000 coins. Jo-in confirms the debt is real, but struggles to explain how such an amount was lent. Chung Myung deduces that Jo-in and his group couldn't possibly have gathered such a sum on their own. How did a failing city's merchants manage this? Jo-in explains the concept of interest, describing how a small initial loan snowballed into a massive debt. Disgusted, Chung Myung punches him, admonishing him not to be proud of such deceit. Chung Myung shifts the conversation, asking if Jo-in owns the linen shop. Jo-in confirms it has been in his family for generations. Yet this makes no sense, as the linen shop also belonged to Mount Hua. Realizing the city's businesses were entrusted to merchants by the sect, Chung Myung concludes these merchants have been embezzling from Mount Hua for years. At that moment, a man appears, accusing Chung Myung of cowardice and calling him a shameless thief. Confused, Chung Myung questions the accusations, noting he had stood openly before them. Letting go of Jo-in, he asks the man's identity. The stranger demands to know Chung Myung's name before challenging him with a blade. Unfazed, Chung Myung comments on the man's earlier defeat. Angered, the man charges, sword drawn, shouting for the boy to prepare himself. Chung Myung calmly observed the situation. He had far superior speed and physical strength compared to the man, but that did not necessarily mean the man was weaker. Strength and speed were far from the best indicators of power. Tossing the sword into his hand, Chung Myung deflected the attack using his shoulder. The man, utterly baffled, stared as Chung Myung accessed a lifetime's worth of memories. If his current child's body lacked physical strength, he only needed to use the opponent's strength against them. Redirecting the impact back, the man was flung far away. At that moment, Chung Myung extended his arm and drew his blade. A few petals appeared around him as he told the man he still had much to learn. Appearing behind the man in an instant, he used the double blossom sword technique. The poor fellow collapsed to the ground, unconscious. But then, Chung Myung heard someone exclaim in awe and realized his mistake. He had forgotten about Joe Goul, who had seen everything, including that specific technique. Worse still, Joe Goul's dumbstruck expression suggested he recognized it. Joe Goul remarked on the refined nature of the attacks, the martial mastery, and the incredible technique he had witnessed. He seemed certain of something startling. Chung Myung began to worry. Had Joe Goul figured it out? Then, Joe Goul asked if he was a member of the SWORDSMAN sect. Caught off guard, Chung Myung paused, confused. He eventually agreed, stating that he was indeed a proud member of the Great Swordsmen sect. Satisfied, Joe Goul promised to share everything he wanted to know. Chung Myung thanked him nonchalantly. Back at the sect, Yoon Jong and Joe Goul paced back and forth, anxiously wondering why Chung Myung hadn't returned yet. Yoon Jong lamented how crazy it was to let him go out alone like that. Still, he was confident the boy would return unless something terrible had happened. Just as he said this, the door creaked open, and Chung Myung walked in, asking if anything had occurred in his absence. Yoon Jong immediately retorted that they were the ones who should be asking him what happened, given his sudden disappearance. Chung Myung casually replied that it was nothing serious, and that he had even managed to earn some extra money. In that moment, he remembered Joe Goul's question about whether he was from the SWORDSMAN sect. Although it was a relief that his true identity hadn't been uncovered, it still stung a little. Even the signature technique of Mount Hua, the blossoming blade technique, had been mistaken for a different sect's method. Joe Goul then asked what he had been doing outside. Chung Myung simply replied that children didn't need to know such things. Annoyed, they retorted that he was just a child himself. Ignoring their complaints, Chung Myung instructed them to gather everyone for training. Joe Goul was confused, especially since it was nighttime. But Chung Myung insisted, explaining that whether it rained, snowed, or shined, they wouldn't miss a single day of training. Joe Goul grew excited at the prospect of training and eagerly agreed, saying he'd gather everyone immediately. He asked if Chung Myung would join them, but Chung Myung declined, stating that he had other matters to attend to. Yoon Jong pointed out that they could only train properly when Chung Myung was around. Without him, no one would take it seriously. Still, Chung Myung assured them he was aware of this and reiterated for them to gather the others. As they left, Chung Myung collapsed onto his bed, pondering his next move. The situation was more complicated than he had anticipated. The city merchants were trying to take over, and the documents proving Mount Hua's ownership of the businesses had likely been lost long ago during the sect's downfall. While he could storm the city and deal with the merchants by force, such actions would only tarnish Mount Hua's reputation further. He needed a justification to prove the sect's rightful ownership, but finding such evidence seemed daunting. He recalled seeing the sect leader, Zhang, filling out property records. When he checked, however, the records were far too few. It struck him as odd. Surely Mount Hua's assets couldn't be documented on so few sheets of paper. This led him to suspect that Zhang had hidden the rest elsewhere. Perhaps there was a vault that only the leader could access. Rumors of such a place had circulated before, and if it existed, its entrance was likely near the leader's quarters. Despite being a martial arts sect, the location had remained unchanged over the years. However, locating the entrance wouldn't be easy. He would need to investigate thoroughly. Determined, Chung Myung leapt out of bed, opened the door, and jumped out of his room. Apologizing silently to Zhang for what he was about to do, he promised not to touch the treasure and to hand it over to the leader. though he doubted he'd keep that promise. The scene shifted to a flash of light in the mountains, where Chung Myung lay sprawled on the ground, exhausted. He had underestimated the mountain's size and the effort required to search for the vault. Concentrating energy into his palms, he slammed them into the ground, sensing how the soil resisted. Though he was certain the vault was nearby, hours passed without success. Still, he refused to give up, repeatedly sending out energy impacts until he finally felt something unusual. With renewed determination, he grabbed a pickaxe and declared that he'd found it. Now all he had to do was dig.